our first installment of Decarb Debrief. I'm Wendy Placco. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager here at RMF. And I'm super proud to be bringing this to you today. It has been in the works since I started about 7 months ago. And so I'm really excited to share it with you all today. And I will introduce our wonderful guest for today, the lovely Martha Larson. Can you say a few things about yourself and your background, Martha?
I started out about 25 years ago in the business. I had a mechanical engineering degree from Northwestern University, and I started out right away doing CAD drawings and specs and projects in acoustical engineering. So that was my first experience, usually as a subcontractor to an engineering firm, to an architect, and sometimes directly to an owner. But those projects were very large and complex, concert halls and theaters, and I got exposed through that to owners' project rep work, owners OPM. We sometimes call it OPM, OPR. And I spent the next 7 years working on large municipal projects in the city of Chicago, so the public housing and the tollway systems, and also continuing work on performing arts and visual arts museum projects. And really wanted to get more involved in the environment. There was an advent of people getting LEED certification. There was a better awareness in design and construction of the importance and the impact on sustainability. And I fortunately then migrated to a position at Carleton College, which is a small liberal arts college in Minnesota. And they were developing their first project management / energy manager / sustainability director role. It was very new. And so it included a lot of different tasks. And through that, I really cut my teeth on things anywhere ranging from negotiating with the utilities for our procurement contracts to metering, commissioning, energy audits, all the way up to building 2 commercial sized wind turbines and managing those. And for most of my career was spent at Carleton in a steam to hot water heating system transition that incorporated geo-exchange heat pumps. And when that project wrapped up in 2021, I was looking for my next adventure. I'm new RMF through contacts at IDEA, and they offered the role of sustainability director, which again is a new role for RMF. But I loved the people, I loved the client portfolio, I loved the full service engineering that RMF brings to the table. And so it was a great fit for me. So in 2022, I joined the team here at RMF.
Yay, and we're so lucky to have you. Martha's my boss. I think she's a great boss, and I'm excited to dive in with a few questions for you today. So as we get started, I had a couple of questions in the chat of asking
Yep,
how many people are on today. We have 111 folks on right now.
amazing.
So
Thank you everyone
I
for
am so
signing up
thrilled
today.
that we've got a
Mhm.
third of the company listening today. So thank you all for being here. So to get started, what I want to talk about is why are we here with this webinar? And I want to start with sharing this stat. This is something that makes a big impact in my day-to-day. The fact that 27% of global carbon emissions come from building operations. This stat is supported by the Architecture 2030 plan. And when we think about all of the things that we can be doing to curb decarbonization, this idea of this issue, we are, as engineers, we are all standing on top of this really great opportunity to have a really sizable impact. And so that's really why we're bringing this here to you today. Add to that the fact that there are a lot of regulations that are changing right now that can be the drivers for change. So what you're looking at right now is a chart showing all of the states in the United States that currently have greenhouse gas reduction targets. If you don't know what that means, that's okay. We'll get into vocab in a moment. So all of these states have some regulations that are in place asking people to curb some of their greenhouse gas emissions. And so with that, I think what I'd like to do is just preface that and dive in today on what our discussion is going to be. And really, it's centered around what is this word decarbonization? That's what we're focused on in Decarb Debrief. So Martha, can you help us understand that language of the word decarbonization and how it relates to the idea of sustainability? So you and I both have sustainability in our titles. What's the difference between decarb and sustainability?
Right. Yeah. In this first session, we really intended it to be an overview and vocabulary clarification. I always think of sustainability as a very broad umbrella term, and that encompasses everything from supply chain sustainability, waste management, food systems, restoration of biodiversity. It can mean anything related to sustaining the environments that sustain us. So that's a little bit too broad for what we do. And the term that has evolved over the past, let's say, 4 to 5 years is decarbonization, which focuses specifically on reducing carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from the use of fossil fuels. That falls into both the transportation category and then also the building operations. So for us, we're really focused on reducing fossil fuel emissions in building operations.
Great. So let's unpack that a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit about what the result is of these fossil fuel usage and the idea of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of kind of pop culture references to this. Mainstream media has talked about it quite a bit, but the idea is that greenhouse gases, and this being an array of different emissions, can cause warming, and the warming can cause different weather patterns and different outcomes. So it can be polar vortexes, it can be floods, it can be heat waves. And we're seeing more and more of that as our weather patterns change. Minnesota barely got any snow last year. I've lived here most of my nearly 50 years on Earth, and that has never happened before, that we had barely any snow. So things like that are where we're really experiencing that impact. And again, what we often say is carbon emissions, but what we mean is greenhouse gas emissions. The reason you hear this term carbon emissions is because oftentimes the quantification of greenhouse gas emissions is normalized in terms of their relative impact compared to carbon. So all of these different gases get normalized compared to carbon when we talk about a carbon emissions inventory, a carbon footprint, or a greenhouse gas inventory.
And so when we say decarbonization, what we're talking about is having less of all of these various
Correct.
greenhouse gases.
Yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer, but that's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Can you, now I remember we talked a little bit about this of there's some history behind regulation driving change in greenhouse gases. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. We had kind of some interesting conversations with Rick talking about his early days of his career in looking at boiler burners. And at that time, the engineering industry was really focused on reducing NOx and SOx. And so what we've sort of framed this as is we're now just looking at a broader array of emissions. It's something that engineers have been doing for quite some time. We've also been focused on energy efficiency for quite some time. So none of this is new. It's just getting defined under different terms and different standards and different goals.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So now that we have defined what decarbonization is, can we talk a little bit about ways that it is classified? So we have this whole guy. Can you walk us through this?
A bit dizzying if you haven't seen it before. And for those that have seen it before, you know it well. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we talk about how those emissions are emitted. And this is where RMF's work really comes into it. Scope 1 emissions are direct fuels burned on site. That can be primarily it's oil and gas burned in boilers. It can also be fuel in vehicles that are owned by the client and used on their property. So it's anything that's burned directly on site. Scope 2 emissions are generated upstream, and usually this is purchased electricity. So there's gas or coal being burned by the utility company, and they're sending electricity to in this case, it would be like a university campus or a corporate campus. So that fuel doesn't have emissions once it's used on site, but the emissions are coming upstream. So RMF's work focuses mostly on scope 2, which is usually purchased electricity, but sometimes purchased steam if we have a external steam provider, third-party steam provider, and then scope 1, which again is all the fuels burned on site. We do dabble in scope 3 occasionally when we have to, but that gets much hairier because scope 3 is associated with emissions that are due to the activities of the organization. That could be air travel, that could be student study abroad travel, waste, paper usage, things that are much harder to track. But if you are a corporation or a higher education institution, usually your accounting protocols require you to track in some manner your scope 3 emissions.
Right. And I'm just gonna share this. So we tend to not pay much attention to scope 3 in our work with the clients because from how I've heard it described, that's more about like we're focused on changing structures. So, whether that's building, whether
Operation.
that's infrastructure, that's operations. And scope 3 is really more about behavior changes for human behavior. And that is on the client. We are not in the business of doing that yet, I would say. So this is just a little bit about scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the big takeaway here is that's what we focus on for clients. Now, I'm glad, Martha, that you referenced the term accounting. Can you tell us a little bit about how we count these kinds of emissions and what kind of ways are we reducing them?
Sure. This is a familiar graphic to our master planning team, but some of you may not have seen this before. It's often called a wedge chart or carbon reduction wedge diagram. And what it means is that top line, kind of the top of the blue wedge there, is where this client's carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions will head over time to the year 2050 if they do nothing different than today. They don't buy any renewable energy credits, their grid doesn't get greener, nothing happens on their fuel supply side. And what climate action planning is about is looking at where that projected growth will be. That's headcount growth, and it's also square footage growth, predicting where the greenhouse gas emissions will be over time, and then inserting, as you see these colorful layers, strategies to reduce emissions. And so in this case, there are a number of strategies that you can see in the legend there that contribute to the reduction. And at the end in 2050, there's still a little bit of that gray bar left. So they still have some remaining emissions. In this case, it's mostly scope 3 emissions, which we just talked about are harder for an engineering team to address. It's not really within our scope to address those. And so institutions will have to resort to policy changes, behavior changes, and purchasing carbon offsets. That's a whole different webinar topic, but the basic gist is carbon offsets can be used to achieve what we call net zero energy, net zero carbon emissions, or a net zero carbon footprint. Again, terminology gets used synonymously here in somewhat of a confusing way, but that's what the net means in net zero. It's reduce as much as you can in reality, and then purchase offsets or renewable energy credits to essentially reduce the rest of your carbon footprint.
Yep, thanks for that. So just to summarize for the crowd, I think that I had a really great question at the Charleston town hall meeting from Sam. Shout out to Sam. What are we after for a deliverable or an outcome when we are doing decarbonization work? Well, this is an example of it. Net zero can be an outcome that our clients are going for. It can also be a certain percentage reduction.
Right.
So that is the outcome that we are working with clients to get when we are engaging in work. So,
usually there are interim targets because net zero is extremely difficult to achieve.
That's a good point. Yeah, a lot of times we see something like we want to do this reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. That's a really common piece of language. So I think this is a great segue into going into, what is the landscape that started bringing this sort of thing about? So let's go dig into that a little bit. So what we've got here is looking a little bit at the national landscape. And Martha, you do such a great job of saying where this kind of came from. First off, we have these emissions reduction targets that we talked about at the start of the hour, the fact that regulations are driving some of this change and causing us to come up with some of these solutions. But then also I wanted to chat a little bit about the variances between those regulations. Can you tell us about that?
Sure, they certainly vary. There's no real federal standard right now. There have been attempts to create federal standards, but they're not as broad and encompassing as what we're seeing at a state or even a local level. So you can see here, even within Massachusetts, the state has its own targets, but Cambridge has developed their own policies. So we have anything on a state level or a city level or sometimes even a municipal level. And here we're seeing net zero emissions targets, percent reduction targets. Sometimes they are focused purely on electricity, like you see in Virginia, because it's a little bit easier to wrap your arms around reducing electricity emissions. And then sometimes they are full, scope 1 and 2 emissions. states can really enforce this with their own municipally owned buildings. So there are also then
Mhm.
within these state regulations, more specific regulations for buildings that are owned by the state. And we also see what are called stretch codes. And Stephanie LaFontaine from the Boston office recently sent out the updated Massachusetts code, where municipalities and local cities can adopt a stretch code to the state energy code. So there's an energy code basis, but then there are advanced requirements that are optional and voluntary for individual cities and municipalities. So we're seeing more of that. That's happening in Minnesota now too. And it's something, an additional thing that we need to evaluate when we're looking at energy codes in our projects. So even the states that you see that are gray here are using examples from other states, and we're seeing some form of regulations rolling out in a number of places. So I'd just say it's something we really have to keep our eye on and stay up to date on, because it's a changing landscape literally by the day, by the month.
And that's why we're here. We're here. We'll keep up on that. So, all right, next up, talk to me a little bit about the original drivers of some of this information.
Well, a lot of what
Or,
all of us saw in this
yes.
industry, starting in the late 90s, especially, was a development of standards. And so we've done a number of LEED projects and Green Globes projects. The Boston office now has a FIAS project, which is a passive house dorm at Harvard. And that is the goal of those structures is net zero energy. So they make as much energy as they use throughout the year. And then even more aggressive standards, the one in the middle, the Living Future Institute, they administer the Living Building Challenge, which has a number of different petals or sections, but they focus on regenerative buildings. So buildings that generate more clean water or generate more energy than they use. So they're, and then again, the one in the lower left is the WELL standard. That's more focused on human health. So how is the air quality? What are the policies? It even drifts into HR policies. So these are each kind of putting their own lens on what how we're defining a sustainable building. And I'll point out the one at the top, Envision, is actually created by the structural engineering industry, knowing that the building certifications don't really apply to civil engineering or civil engineering. Envision was created for civil engineering projects. So we're seeing these pop up as voluntary owner selected certifications that the design teams and construction teams then get held to as part of the project.
Yeah, and I can see these as another outcome of the work in decarbonization is the official certification
The
of a
goal
building.
is to achieve the
Exactly.
certification. Yep, at a certain
Exactly.
level.
Shout out to my buildings folks. This would affect you of
Yep.
these are the kinds of requirements that you might be designing to.
And we'll see that sometimes on a project by project basis, and sometimes we'll see it written into design and construction standards for a client. So all buildings need to at least meet, LEED gold or LEED silver. So we have to, I know many of our engineers are already managing those types of projects.
Great. All right. So next up, talking about, okay, we've talked about what the owner might be looking for, but then let's talk about some drivers on our side, the people in our industry.
Yeah, this really started with the architecture industry developing AIA 2030. This is 10 or 15 years ago now, when 2030 felt far away, and now it's very close. But their commitment, and a number of firms signed this, was to only design net zero energy buildings by 2030. And this comes with reporting and accountability, just like a LEED certification would, but it's for the firm and the firm's work, and they opt into this. We have now seen one developed by the MEP industry called MEP 2040, topic of another webinar. And there's also the SE 2050. So structural engineers went out a little bit further, and this SE 2050 focuses on embodied carbon in the materials that are used, as well as more sustainable construction techniques.
Yeah, so there's more than just the design. It's the materials that go into the build. So there's so many things to consider when you're talking about decarbonization and the holistic nature of it. Is it more carbon neutral to rebuild too? You have to ask yourself that question. So that's great. Cool. So let's move on then to, where's my cursor? There it is. Talking about this guy, this is a hot topic in the industry because
Yep.
the Inflation Reduction Act, also known as the IRA, is a significant funding opportunity for our clients. Can you give us a primer on that?
Sure. And this one, again, could be its own webinar and has been its own webinar.
Mm.
There are many consultants, lawyers, tax advisors out there trying to become experts at this because it is such an enormous opportunity. Projects that meet the requirements of being categorized as an energy property, that's this one on the far left, section 48, are eligible for anywhere from 6% to 50% of their costs, that's labor and materials, to be reimbursed by the government. The requirements are quite complicated, as you may imagine, and they mostly focus on the project has to pay prevailing wage in the area. They have to meet a certain percent of apprentices on their job, and that gets audited throughout the job. If they can't, they have to justify why in a certain way. And then they have to have a certain amount of domestic content. So for steel and iron, it's 100% domestic. And for manufactured products, it's 40% domestic. And again, there are a number of rules. The IRS is spitting out guidance daily on how to define all of that. But this is also why clients are bringing on consultants like KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers to advise them on how to document all of that. There are ways to justify if it's increasing costs to an unreasonable amount or those materials aren't available. Like some of our heat pump selections just aren't available as a purely domestic content device. So there's then documentation associated with why can't meet the requirements. But because the amount of money is so significant, our clients are looking into this, and it does become worthwhile to at least evaluate it. The lesser areas of focus are section 179D is for making buildings more than 50% more energy efficient than they were before the project, or 50% more efficient than code if it's a new building. And those credits come to the design teams and then get sort of passed through to the owner. So this is owners don't like this one. It's a trickier one to accomplish, and it's confusing. And then the one on the far right is much simpler. It's very basic credits, just cash back for EV charging stations, electric vehicle purchases, etc.
Yeah. So there's a lot to know here. I think some big takeaways are that RMF tends to partner with a tax consultant on behalf of the organization in order to walk through all of the documentation and management of this program. I think in terms of where engineers' role comes into play, tends to be in the design side and making sure that we're hitting the marks that the IRA is requiring. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I would say we rely on the owner. We don't take responsibility for this. It's really on the owner and the contractor procurement. But again, if you get into a project that's inquiring about the IRA, let us know. Wendy and I have gone deep in the weeds on this with some clients where we're learning, but we don't want to be positioned as an advisor on this. We can flag things, but it's very difficult to advise on it specifically.
That's awesome. Great. So I think next, just keeping up, we got to keep moving on because sorry that this might seem fast for folks, but we really care about getting to the Q&A portion for you. So now I want to shift the conversation a little bit to some of the industries that we have focused in and are focusing in for this work. Can you give us an overview starting with the higher ed landscape?
Sure. We'll do kind of a lightning round here on our sectors. In 2007, higher ed leaders came together to create the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. There were two parts. One was three immediate actions: start a recycling program, start tracking your carbon footprint, etc. And then they had to establish a date by which their campus would be carbon neutral, or climate neutral is another way to say that. And they had to, within 2 years, publish a plan on how they would get there. So the institution that I was at, Carleton, I arrived when they were just writing that plan. Other institutions have published plans. Some have met their goals, some have not. But since then, since 2007, they've split this into three pieces. So if you run into these terms, now the carbon commitment is in the middle there. That's still reducing carbon by a specific date. There's a resilience commitment on the right, which is about integration with the community for community resilience in case of climate disasters, and also just simply backup and resilience, like we would always think of backup and resilience in the case of an emergency. And the schools that have signed on to both the carbon and the resilience commitment essentially have signed the one on the left, the climate commitment. So the climate commitment is an umbrella if you've signed both the carbon and the resilience commitment. So your higher ed clients may be speaking in these terms. That's why we wanted to bring them up and define them here today.
And I think that there can be a misnomer for our engineering staff about resilience versus the concept of redundancy resilience versus resilience of like we have a backup and an emergency center for crises. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's about the social aspects of
Right.
a disaster recovery and disaster management, as well as the technical aspects. It's a
Yeah.
combination of both.
Great, thank you. So for those that are curious, this is a map that Second Nature publishes, showing all of the adoptees of this signed document of the climate commitment. And you'll notice that there are fewer sign-ons for the resilience, and a lot of the reasons for that is because it's a newer component, and most of these are the original signatories. And you might notice too that we have over 30 of RMF's current and past clients that have signed on to this. And what that builds in for us is accountability. I think that we have noted a difficulty in the decarbonization space for anybody in other industries is how are they staying accountable onto making the goals that they've set for themselves. And higher ed is really holding itself to the standard. Not only do they have this climate commitment, but they also have students holding their feet to the fire, and they have that added bonus of they stand to recover their investment on their property over time because they're not going anywhere. So that's a big reason that higher ed has been a big focus for us.
And if you want to see if your clients are on this list, that at the lower left there, it has secondnature.org. You can go to that website, click the reporting box and see if your clients have signed these commitments.
Yeah, check that out. Just in the interest of time, can you go over quickly the ASHE
2 seconds
STARS
on this.
program?
This is different from carbon accounting. STARS is a very comprehensive sustainability survey that is for self-benchmarking, and it encompasses policy, administration, DEI, everything under the sun. It's a 240 question survey. So when institutions talk about STARS, decarbonization and buildings are only 2 or 3 of the questions inside the operations section, which is only one of 12 sections in the STARS rating system. So this is different, very different from the carbon accounting goals that we are focused on. It's much broader.
More holistic. Yep, exactly. So let's move on to talking about healthcare for a minute.
So healthcare has taken the blueprint that was written by higher ed, and the Department of Health and Human Services took the mantle on this and developed another voluntary commitment focused on healthcare sector. And again, these pledges are aspirational. They're also fairly broad, but this is where we've seen voluntary commitment by healthcare organizations like Advent, one of our clients in North Carolina. And these are the 3 major components of their commitment. They have to reduce carbon emissions, set a goal, designate leadership, and develop a resilience plan, which includes, again, redundancy on a technical side and also community resilience considerations. And a lot of what healthcare is focused on is human health and making the connection between climate risks and health risks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we're talking about that accountability factor. We have higher ed with their situation, but with healthcare, climate change has impacts to human health, including air quality, et cetera. So it is part of this commitment makes a lot of sense for healthcare to adopt because they also maybe have systems that they might recover their investments over time. And they also want to do best for their patients, do right by their patients. So great.
And you might see a broader, again, like STARS for higher ed, healthcare developed their much broader practicegreenhealth.org is where you'll find that in healthcare.
So next, let's dive into the federal government sector. This is a major component of RMF's client portfolio. And this particular order is all about the things that federal clients, their own selves as client need to adopt, if I'm correct.
Yep, and this came into play with the Biden-Harris administration in about 2022, and we've run into it on the VA when we've been doing some master planning for the VA and other federal clients. And Bob Smith and I have attended the Federal Energy Management Program annual conference, FEMP, and there's a lot of focus on this. So Department of Defense is really out ahead on a lot of the carbon reduction because of the nature of trying to create resilient and independent energy systems for a lot of their sites. But we're seeing more and more of the GSA, different federal government arms trying to get their head around how they will meet this executive order, which, as you can see, does include purchasing of carbon-free electricity or production of it, migrating to zero-emission vehicles, things that we know are familiar to RMF, but it also incorporates things like environmental justice and a climate-focused workforce. So again, this is about technology, but it's also about people and climate literacy within the federal government system.
Yeah, and I think that, for us as somebody that supports federal projects, let's talk about how what we are required to do as somebody that consults with the federal government.
Sure. We are reviewing right now the Federal Supplier Climate Risks and Resilience Proposed Rule, which is an outcrop of that executive order. And this is, again, for their procurement focus. So we as a supplier, we are in the significant contractors, I believe, that line there that Wendy's highlighted on the slide. So we will be required to say that we are reporting or tracking our emissions, our carbon footprint as a company. So that would include our utilities that we use in our office spaces, our air travel, our commuting emissions associated with commuting, which would be our scope 3 emissions. And so Wendy and I are working right now on a process for how to collect and account for RMF's carbon footprint. We are not yet meeting the threshold of a major contractor, but that's where you actually have to establish targets and identify climate risks. So the stakes get a little higher as we get more and more federal work.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue, because next we want to focus in on ourselves, what's going on internally here at RMF. Carbon accounting is one piece of that for the requirements for our federal clients. But first, could we just talk big picture about why RMF is really well suited for this kind of work, Martha?
And what we're really recognizing is how well positioned we are for this work, because it is so integrative. It integrates whole systems. So systems that start with a planning exercise need to design new plants, new thermal distribution. We are especially, we excel at thermal distribution. We excel at electricity systems. And of course, electrical resilience is going to be a key part of decarbonizing through transitioning to renewable electricity. And we go all the way through building MEP, so the demand side, and the commissioning. We're working right now on commissioning, just simply for the sake of saving energy, retro commissioning efforts, but also commissioning new systems that are focused on lower carbon technologies. So we're very excited about our position in this market and our ability to frame RMF's already existing strengths in terms of what the market is asking for now in terms like decarbonization plans or roadmaps.
Yeah, I think that it really is suiting RMF well for this kind of work, and it speaks to what your and my role is. This webinar is a very important component of educating the full team about what kinds of things we need to be considering for decarbonization, so that we are working with each other. Martha and I do not have designs to grow our office over here to 80 people and just do our thing. Our goal is to be working across the whole team and having you educate us about the kinds of work that we need to do in order to apply our decarbonization learning to our clients' needs overall. So now is the time. I shall stop sharing my screen, and we want to hear from you with any questions that you have for us. I already have a question from the audience asking, what are some practical ways structural engineering can contribute to decarbonization, or specifically net zero construction? What are your thoughts on that, Martha?
Yeah, I'm less familiar with structural than I am with mechanical, MEP, but the way this is coming to play is if you do look at that SE 2050 commitment, Structural Engineering 2050, it does define many of the ways that structural engineers are beginning to think about their role in these projects. And with structural, it's usually with respect to construction, less so operations, but more what are the materials we're choosing to construct? How much embodied carbon do they have, which means how much carbon does it take to produce them and to construct them? And then, of course, there's a focus on reuse and adaptation of existing structures being lower carbon than building new and demolishing existing structures. So those are the ways that structural engineers are framing this. Also, the Envision certification is one to look into for civil structural, because again, noting that LEED and Green Globes are very buildings-based. The civil structural engineering industry developed Envision to address other issues that are more related to civil and structural engineering.
One other thing that I'll add to that, I got a great general question in Charleston about what can all of us do. And one general piece of advice that I would give to anybody learning about the decarbonization realm is to, number one, come at it humbly. Just listen and let it wash over you. Don't expect yourself to understand everything overnight and all of the complexities, because it is so holistic. And just stay curious and ask a lot of questions. Start to ask those questions of us as your support structure, but then also of clients. What are you thinking about? What are your goals? Starting to probe and seeing what their goals are and how we can help hit them is going to be really important.
And I will say, Wendy and I are learning every day too. We have a network of subject matter experts. You know, Bill Mahoney and Eric Krinchuk are getting very quickly up to speed on heat pump technology. The master planning group also, Brian Wadka has looked into small modular nuclear reactors. So what part of our role is to kind of serve as curators of that information and matchmakers, so that when you need a resource who truly is a subject matter expert, we can connect you with the right people, even inside RMF.
Awesome. All right, our next question, and this is a good one. Does the IRA apply to tax exempt institutions?
Yes, the new thing about the IRA, which is different from the old incentives, production tax credit. I'll tell you, when we built the wind turbines at Carleton, it was very complicated to take advantage of those rules because we were a tax exempt organization. You had to set up sort of a shell organization that was corporate to get access to the tax benefits. The biggest change with the IRA is that nonprofits and tax exempt organizations can now access money through what they call the direct pay option, which means you can directly get a reimbursement. Now you have to pay the cost up front and then file for the reimbursement with your tax return. So you don't get it beforehand. It's not a financing tool, but that's the huge change about this rule is tax exempt organizations are in.
Great question, Jared. Next up, we've got Ulysses with a two-parter. Thanks, Ulysses. So number one, what happens when clients don't meet their targets?
You know,
extra taxes, targets, dollar penalties, what can happen?
If it's internal targets in their own design and construction standards, there's usually a lot of conversation about why. And there's usually justification for why. It's pricing, it's availability of materials, changes in administration. So there are ways that internally they have to have those conversations. We're seeing, let's take Boston as an example. Boston and Cambridge have their own regulations, which will be based soon. I'm sure somebody in the chat can tell me exactly when, but there is a cost per ton of carbon emissions, and it's a very hefty fee. Last I checked, it was $234 per ton of carbon emissions. And building owners will have to pay that if by a certain date they are not able to make their buildings carbon neutral. And those fees go into a fund that funds more carbon reduction activities for the city. So it depends on where you are, and it depends on the nature of the regulations.
Yeah, great.
And the second one there, I see it.
So does Decarb cover standby power such as generators? So this is the redundancy question, and how is that, what do we do if that's not decarbonized?
Yeah, and I'll answer this a little bit broadly, which is the best decarbonization strategies that we've seen are still very practical, and they usually end up being hybrid solutions. So with the project that I did at Carleton was geo-exchange heat pumps for the base load, which was about 70% of heating and cooling, and then gas-fired boilers, very efficient hot water boilers, but still gas-fired boilers for both peaking in the winter and redundancy, and then standard electric chillers for peaking in the summer. So standby power sort of falls into that category where we still need resilience, we still need backup, we can't compromise safety, we can't compromise continuous operations. So oftentimes what we'll see is a client that's moving toward a decarbonized campus will engage with lower carbon technologies for their base loading, but still keep diesel generators or something similar, propane, on hand for backup, because it is so important. And there aren't yet 100% reliable, 100% available renewable energy solutions, and we know that.
And if we have some kind of outage and pipes start to freeze and things start to explode or lab samples start to expire, that's no good. We definitely want to have a redundancy plan in place.
We do. And there's a comment there too, Wendy, about hydrogen, which just briefly I'll say, master planning team has great slides on this, but there are different types of hydrogen that you'll hear about in our next Decarb debrief. Some of them are truly green and some of them
Mm,
are not. And hydrogen either needs to be piped or transported over land from a production facility. So the challenges with hydrogen are very unique. And as we've heard, it's a big buzzword, but the whole conversation on hydrogen hubs is very much still evolving. You'll hear more about that
yeah.
when Kristen does her next installments
Yay. Thanks for covering that. I
of
missed
Decarb
that.
debrief. Mm-hmm.
All right, next up we have a question from Taylor. So
Mm-hmm.
we have the question, will RMF maintain a client slash project list to introduce possible wide range of decarb projects? I can start to answer this
Yeah.
question. So we will be covering in this webinar series some case studies for you to learn from. So we are covering it that way. Right now, we don't particularly have an ongoing list, but Taylor, I also want to make sure we're answering your question properly. So I'm going to press this button that allows you to talk if you want to ask for some clarification here. Oh, but there's also a brochure that Caroline is saying behind me that you can look at about our abilities and some of our
Yeah, our
projects.
project sheets, we are developing, as with all of our marketing materials, we're developing project sheets, and many of those emphasize a decarbonization effort on certain projects. But we do continuous improvement there is what
Yeah.
our goal there.
Yeah, the goal sounds good. Just curious where that central place, if it's brochure or
Where does
list
it live?
somewhere, where does it live? We've got stuff
Mm-hmm.
as small as 15,000 square foot geothermal heat pump fire stations to
Yeah.
Good
huge
point.
campus-wide conversions.
I
So
I love
definitely a
that. And
variety.
that's I think one of the things that we're looking for from this presentation is your ideas. So maybe it's a spreadsheet that's always up to date or something like that. But I love that idea and we'll get on that. All right. So next up we have Chase asking, what should we be telling clients who ask about the IRA
Yeah.
benefits? Do we have expertise to advise or subcontractors that we would recommend?
Yeah, I would say we can offer bullet points. You know, these are the things that you need to think about if you want to even consider whether you qualify. And as you're going into procurement, especially with contractors, what are the things you need to watch out for or put in your specs? This would be the kind of thing that would be in the front end of the spec, the clients section on what's going to be required for to meet our IRA. So I think that's as far as we should go, Chase. Now, there are consultants, I'd say Competitive Energy Services, CES, who we've worked with on a number of projects, is a great resource in terms of consulting, but they're not tax advisors. So they are great. They will offer really detailed advice, but then they will pass to a KPMG or a PricewaterhouseCoopers who actually have to help the institution compile auditable tax documents. And so that's where the rubber meets the road, and people can spend, up to $500,000 on these consultants because it is so detailed. They have to audit every line item of a pay app and pull out everything that's eligible, everything that's not eligible, and try to track all the prevailing wages based on timesheets, all the apprenticeship requirements. If they're not meeting the apprenticeship, they have to audit why. So I'm just kind of giving you a smattering of why this is not something RMF can do for clients. But I think us offering the bullet points of this is what we understand about this legislation and why you client might want to look into it with the right advisors, that we can say.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Martha. Next question, a great one from Kaylee. What conversations should be had about when customers ask about solar?
It's such a big
Well
hot
done.
topic because solar, there are a lot of incentives, readily available equipment. It's very understood now. Solar is very understood. And there are a lot of what they call net metering regulations or tariffs where a utility company actually has to pay you for any extra power that you put onto their grid. And some of us here at the company, many people I talk to at town hall meetings have solar on their home and get that sort of benefit. So I think with solar, the biggest things are we talking about ground mounted solar, meaning taking up open real estate to have solar? Now you can still farm or graze sheep or whatever under your solar array, but that takes up real estate. Or are we talking about rooftop solar? And if we're talking about rooftop, is it really worth it? If you think about a dorm building, it's a huge building with a teeny tiny roof. And often it has dormers or it has clay tile or it has equipment, exhaust, vents, air handling units, rooftop units. So it's a something where we can evaluate it fairly quickly. It's fairly straightforward, but it's a question of, is it worth it? Is there enough space? to make the array worthwhile? Or is it visually just something you want to do for promotion? And oftentimes that's why these demonstration solar projects get put into place, is it's a way to educate and show commitment to sustainability. So that's not a direct answer on solar, but those are the first questions I would ask. There's also a resource that the master planning group can point you to where you can look up the solar access for a GPS map on any location in the US. You can pinpoint a spot and see if it's good for solar and calculate the potential production.
I'm really glad that Kaylee asked that question, though, because the role of renewables is going to be a huge component of what we talk about as we continue this series. And another thing that we think about a lot when we're in terms of infrastructure is solar kind of comes and goes. How are you storing that power for later use? So that tends to be a consideration too.
That's a big consideration.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's see. Next, we have Hagir. What are some current challenges you are experiencing on implementing decarb solutions on a large scale?
Oh gosh, where do we begin? You know, what we look at, it's really important for an institution to have a really good understanding of their campus master plan. How many buildings are they going to build? Where are they going to take buildings down? Where will they have brand new development that offers brand new green space opportunity? And so we look at that. We look at where they're going to renovate buildings significantly, because what we're looking at is a number of things. Most of the time for the scope 1 emissions, fuels burned on site, there are two paths. You can look at renewable fuels, which are very complicated, messy. There's a lot of material handling with things like biomass or biogas. Or you can look at moving your heating and cooling systems to electricity. A lot of the cooling systems are already electric, but heating systems, move them off gas, move them off oil to electric heat pumps. And so the challenges with that are it affects the whole district energy system. It affects the piping, the plant, the buildings that are served by that system. And so not only is it difficult from a cost, financing and phasing perspective, but also the number of stakeholders exponentially increases. So now we're not just talking about facilities folks.
Yeah,
we've got
that was going to be my comment.
Sustainability experts. Yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
Yeah, from my perspective, communications is one of the biggest challenges of projects like these, especially when we're doing a whole infrastructure revamp. A lot of my work as in my role tends to be advising clients on how to communicate with that wide range of stakeholders, because now it's not just engineers talking to facilities or, you know, people that are used to doing facilities management operations, that side of thing. Now we're talking to board of trustees, we're talking to neighbors who are going to be affected, we're talking to all kinds of different audiences, and we need to bring them in on this very complex subject as they can learn. So, you know, right now you're sitting in this webinar that's designed to be, here's a taste, because we can't cover all of this detail in one session. So how are we rolling out communications that is intelligible to all these audiences and keeping them in the loop and best suited to make these major decisions on the future of the institution? So from my perspective, communications is a great challenge, but it's super rewarding to help clients through it. Yeah. So next up on July's third Thursday, which is, let me just look at that quick, the date is going to be July 18th. We have Kristen McMurray from our team, who I will be interviewing again. So I'll be your common thread during this process. But Kristen is going to start by giving us an overview of what the master planning team looks at in terms of what the technology possibilities are in a decarbonization plan. So if you remember that graph from the beginning of the hour today, where they were showing all of the different technologies that can bring us down to net zero, that's what master planning is looking at, and we'll start to evaluate and learn about each of those technologies. So I hope that you can join me then. It's going to be a great time, and props to Kristen for jumping on that. And it's actually a two-parter. There's going to be a suspenseful
There's so much info. We had to make it
There's so much to cover that we can't get through all of it in 1 hour. So I want to thank everybody for joining on. So proud to have this many people on the call today.
Thank you all.
It will be posted to Pipeline as a recording. If you just want to relive the magic, or if you want to refer a colleague to it, happy to have you share that. We'll get that up as soon as possible. So with that, I think let's sign off. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody,
And thank
for
you,
joining us today.
Martha. Wonderful job.
Happy to
Thanks
be
for
here.
being such a great interview subject. All right, take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.